Yeah, order. You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The state of emergency in France, which is being extended for 3 months, will have an impact on the UN Climate Change Conference, which begins on November the 30th in Paris, in which more than 100 heads of state will attend. The French edict means that climate change protesters, normally part of such gatherings, will be banned from demonstrating. But this time, the pressure inside the conference to get a deal has probably never been greater. Here's Rebecca Morell with a short history of the climate change talks haunted by past failures.
Some say the climate meeting in Paris is our last hope. Some 500 kilometres away from Paris, this is Jungfraujoch in the Swiss Alps, nicknamed the top of Europe. This isn't just a tourist attraction with stunning views, although that would be reason enough to come here. Instead, its lofty location gives it something of an edge when it comes to taking in the atmosphere. This high-altitude research station is nearly 4,000 metres above sea level. It's one of a network of stations around the world monitoring greenhouse gases. Over the years, researchers have seen emissions go sky high, carbon dioxide being the biggest culprit. Stefan Reimann is one of the scientists keeping an eye on Europe's air.
This is the CO2 measurement here at Jungfraujoch. We are normally above 400 parts per million. The reading about 10 years ago was definitely below, around 380 ppm. This is actually the highest ever, as far as we know, the last 800,000 years.
Bringing emission levels down will be one of the primary aims of the Paris conference. The pressure is on to get results. But that means 195 countries reaching an agreement. It might sound like a big ask, but it's not impossible for the world to come together. This station was one of the first to monitor CFCs, the man-made gas that, as you may remember, punched a hole in the ozone layer. It got the whole world talking.
The problems will only be solved by common action, and every country must play its full part.
The Montreal Protocol signed the death warrant for ozone-damaging substances, most notably CFCs. Now the ozone layer is on the mend, thanks to this uniquely successful international agreement. So when climate change became the big issue, it was hoped the world could agree again. Efforts began with the Rio Earth Summit in 1992 with the creation of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which called for the stabilisation of greenhouse gas emissions without saying much about how to do it. But it did stipulate there should be a meeting every year called the Conference of the Parties, or COPs. Paris will be the 21st COP. This will be the nerve centre of the negotiations. It might look a bit messy now, but when the representatives of 195 different countries get going, it's going to get a lot messier still. Unfortunately, when these meetings began, they didn't agree on a voting system. So now there has to be a consensus between every country about every single word and every piece of punctuation on every agreement, in 6 different languages. And this is the woman who'll be in charge of the whole thing. Can I just get your official job title so we get it right?
It's absolutely terrible.
Is it long?
Yes, it is, and it means absolutely nothing to anyone. But anyway, Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. I'm very sorry about that.
Do you think we're going to have a deal?
Yes.
Why?
Because governments are not decreasing but increasing their political will, because every single one is already impacted some negatively way by climate change, and they want to address that. So yes, we will have an agreement.
And what's at stake if we don't?
We don't even want to entertain that scenario.
But COPs gone by have been none too inspiring. Although the Kyoto Protocol of 1997 set emission-cutting targets on developed countries, a landmark achievement at the time, America pulled out and others failed to comply. But historically, it had been a good COP. Then came bad COP.
After 2 weeks of talks, the Copenhagen conference ends without long-term agreement on carbon emissions.
The conference ended in acrimony, and already the recriminations have begun.
The leaders were invited in at the end, but inadvertently what that meant was that all of the big political issues were left to the final few days for the leaders to solve, and that proved very, very complicated, and essentially they ran out of time. This time the leaders are being invited at the beginning of the conference to set the overall political direction, to empower their ministers.
Copenhagen did, however, snatch one agreement from the jaws of defeat. 2 is the critical number. Copenhagen reached the consensus that a rise of 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century would be just about as much as the planet could take. Any higher and there could be catastrophic changes. But scientists believe global temperatures have already risen by 1 degree since the middle of the 19th century. So as far as this 2-degree threshold goes, we're already halfway there. As emission levels go on climbing, climate models show global temperatures will follow. The higher we head above the 2-degree rise, the more doomsday-like the UN's climate forecasts get. Melting ice caps, flooded cities, loss of wildlife, food shortages, the list goes on.
The CO2 is a really, really long-lived gas in the atmosphere. So if we cut emissions by, let's say, 30%, 40%, it will still go up. So the increase will just be a little bit lower. But nature cannot, still not cope with what we are emitting.
But as we near the next COP, it's felt that the political climate has evolved. For the first time, most of the countries have already set out what they intend to do to cut emissions. These pledges, called Intended Nationally Determined Contributions, or INDCs, will set the tone of the whole conference. Even China and the US are on board. But when the pledged reductions are taken together, the result will still see global warming bust the 2-degree threshold by the end of the century. So is a meaningful outcome already lost?
Instead of being on a trajectory to 4 or 5 degrees, we're in a trajectory to be under 3 degrees. That is not enough either. But it is certainly a huge dent in the irresponsible and runaway growth in emissions that we had before. So it is a constant review and improve, review and improve. That is going to be the dynamic that Paris will set up.
Since the Industrial Revolution, economic growth has largely risen in parallel with emissions. For things to change, growth needs to be uncoupled from our fossil fuel habit. Developing countries are now told they'll need to give their own carbon-intensive periods a miss and use greener alternatives. But how much financial help they'll get to do that will be a big talking point, as will what money is on hand for the countries who'll be hardest hit by the consequences of global warming. In the coming years, places like Jungfraujoch will be among the first to notice whether this summit has made a big enough difference. Last year was the hottest on record. This year could be hotter still. The question arising in Paris will be whether hopes of hitting a 2-degree target are ever achievable or already lost.
Rebecca Morel. Well, earlier this evening I spoke to the man who was Secretary of State for Climate Change when the last set of climate talks happened in Copenhagen, Ed Miliband. I asked him whether there really was a better chance of agreement at the Paris summit than last time round.
Well, I must say your film brings back slightly unhappy memories. But look, this is such a hard thing that the world is trying to pull off. It's like a Rubik's Cube with many, 195 sides that you're trying to solve. Now, that means you're not going to succeed first time round. And so I think Paris will represent progress. It will represent progress because every major emitter is saying it's actually going to take action. It looks like it's going to make progress on climate finance, and therefore we're going to have to get there in stages, I think.
Let's look at the last time there was a binding agreement. Let's look at Kyoto.
Sure.
As soon as you had a Republican administration, and Kyoto was torn up as far as America was concerned. So presumably an incoming Republican administration should just turn around and boot this out, because there are no world policemen on this.
No, that's true. That's true. But I think some people have talked about having sanctions and all of that. Maybe that's something that will have to be looked at in the future. But personally, I think there are reasons for optimism. Look, I'm not involved in crafting this agreement, but as an objective observer, I'd say we're not where we need to be, but perhaps in a better place than I expected us to be.
You are putting the case for Britain to unilaterally sign up to zero emissions, but why on earth would Britain put itself at such economic disadvantage for actually a minimum improvement to world climate? It would be something that would be totemic, and it would be to our disadvantage.
Well, I don't agree with that. I'm putting the case for a long-term goal of zero emissions for the world, because that's what the science tells us is necessary. I think that we can get that in Paris, but I'm also putting the case for Britain to reflect that commitment in our own domestic law. And I'll tell you why, Kirsty, because you say it'll be bad for our economy. I think quite the opposite. Businesses from Richard Branson to Paul Polman of Unilever to Ratan Tata are all saying, actually, this will give us a sense of certainty. This will give us a sense of where we're working towards. And look, there's going to come a point when the carbon budget for the world will be exhausted. And we might as well anticipate that now and plan towards it. And I think that's what the world should do, and I think it's what Britain should do as well.
But you're also, in a way, with this kind of what you would say would be a very radical agenda of zero emissions, kind of denying the right of developing countries to industrialise. And where does that square with your promise to reduce world poverty? You have to allow countries, surely, to industrialise, to raise the standard of living for their people.
Absolutely right, and that's why I think we can be optimistic for the following reasons. Look, first of all,
but not on zero emissions, not signing countries in South America, not even signing China up to zero emissions.
We're going to have to get to that point because of the science, but here's how countries can also develop. First of all, the rich world is going to have to do its bit to give poor countries the space to develop. Secondly, climate finance as part of this agreement for developing countries is very important. And thirdly, look, the low-carbon path is actually something developing countries are already pursuing.
In terms of leading the way, let's talk about personal responsibility. 5 years ago, it was very much in vogue to talk about demand management. There were campaigns about reducing people's own carbon footprint and so forth. That's just gone now. Why?
I don't think it's gone completely. I think the British public, look, there have been lots of other issues that people have been focusing on, but I think the British public still care about this. I think it's not something that people don't recognise as important, but of course it's, the action we take now is about our children and their children. Now I think it's incredibly important we do act on this.
So do you actually monitor your own carbon footprint?
I try and keep it as low as possible, but I'm not presenting myself. I'm not presenting myself as a paragon of virtue.
How do you actually say, well, I took a flight to Brisbane, I took a flight to Boston, I ran the washing machine 10 times. I mean, what do you actually do?
There's a whole debate about this, but the biggest thing that can happen and the biggest difference I can make is making sure governments act.
Today, Prince Charles has been saying that climate change is a major reason for all the horror in Syria. Do you agree with that?
I think it's one of the issues that has placed stress on Syria. I don't think he's saying it's primarily responsible for.
Well, he's saying it's a major reason.
Well, I think it's widely recognised that the issues of drought and water stress in Syria have been a contributory factor to the issues there. But look, there's very, very complicated issues in Syria, and I don't think he's saying that the most important one is climate change.
Well, let's just talk about Syria, because in 2013, when you were a leader, Labour didn't back airstrikes. Do you think there's a clearer case this time?
I think it's a different case, but it's a case I'm yet to be convinced of. And let me explain why. ISIL have got to be defeated, but the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, I think, did an excellent report on this. And there are two issues in particular that they raise. And it's a difference between Syria and Iraq. Who is going to do the ground operations against ISIL in Syria? Because there hasn't been a clear answer from the government about that. And secondly, what is the political settlement that we're working towards in Syria, and they haven't been clear about that. Now, look, the Prime Minister has promised answers on this. Let's see whether the answers are convincing.
Well, last time round, you followed your conscience and you whipped Labour MPs. This time round, it's really unclear as to what Jeremy Corbyn's going to be doing. Do you think that any vote on military action for Britain to take abroad should be a free vote, should be a vote of conscience?
Look, honestly, that's not a matter for me. That's a matter for Jeremy Corbyn and the Shadow Cabinet.
Ed Miliband, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I've been getting away with it all my